When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Allbirds or Skims, sure, they have a fantastic product, and yes, they have brilliant marketing as well, but an often overlooked secret to it all is the business behind the business, making selling simple, and for millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet, and the not-so-secret secret with Shop Pay that boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going. So if you're into growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that Allbirds and Mattel uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/theathletic, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/theathletic to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/theathletic. As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code THEATHLETIC. Make your first deposit of at least $10, place your first bet on any game, and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
This Friday, from Disney, the musical movie event of the year arrives in theaters.
My name is Snow White.
Flawless.
Exquisite.
Get tickets now.
Waiting on a wish.
Snow White will have you on your feet
I think that's a wonderful idea.
and cheering for more.
I was thinking the same thing.
Experience the magical story.
Magic mirror on the wall. Who's the fairest one of all?
Snow White.
Disney's Snow White. Only in theaters Friday. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Tickets on sale now.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and Lando Norris lived up to his and McLaren's favourite tag by winning in Australia. But how close did it come to losing it? And was the intervention of team orders that forced Oscar Piastri to hold position entirely necessary? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to unravel a classic chaotic season opener are Mark Hughes and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Well, Scott, we did get a race. We were discussing how excited we were to get a season opener in Australia for the race after what happened last time. There's a bit of a moment where it looked a bit dicey with the rain.
Yeah, you did point out a few hours before the Grand Prix started that, having guaranteed on our preview podcast on Wednesday that at least compared to 2020 we could definitely at least expect a race, we were then a bit worried that might not happen. It's been awful since very early this morning, waking up seeing how much rain there was. I think the Formula 3 race got off today, but the Supercars race was cancelled, the Formula 2 race was cancelled, and there was a point until probably about an hour and a half before the race started where it was still heavy rain. And then obviously it tried to come back with a vengeance, didn't it, during the Grand Prix, and it definitely came back with a vengeance after the Grand Prix when all of us were running around the paddock getting absolutely soaked. But it made for a very, very interesting day. Yeah, very, very much so. Kind of delivered on expectations, didn't it, Mark? We wanted a dramatic race, although the favourite won, which sometimes means it was quite dull. It was pretty much action-packed throughout, so just what we wanted.
Yeah, it was, and I think had it been a straightforward race, just decided on pure performance, we would have seen one of the McLaren drivers win anyway. We're not sure which one. But the way that we got there was very interesting, and it was just being randomised, and so every chance that Norris got to sort of, exploit the performance of his car was brought up short by something random happening. So, kept getting reset and kept Norris having all sorts of challenges thrown at him to get around, because it was potentially disastrous in the context of this as his title chase. Yeah, and that of Piastri's as well. They're the obvious. They're the two guys in the fastest car. So for Norris, after how his season went last year, for it to have gone wrong in this race, which it could have done in many different ways, wouldn't have been very good for his mental state, I guess.
Absolutely. I think it was important for that whole team to have a good, solid weekend. Obviously, it didn't work out for Oscar Piastri, but the pace was good. They got the win. I think it was just the settled start that they needed, and certainly proved that McLaren is the strongest car. But let's get into the race in detail, Mark. So for the first time this season, can you answer your favourite question of how the race was won?
It was won partly on performance and part on the McLaren being just the best car. It had about 3/10 on everyone. And more importantly, it could hold on to its rear tyre performance for longer than all the others, a lot longer. So there was that. There was also the way that they dealt with the few random calls. So when the Norris and Piastri hit that wall of water, and they both sort of spun and or half spun in the case of Norris, and spun onto the grass and got stuck there in the case of Piastri. They reacted to that perfectly, and they brought him in immediately, because it was just the rain had just arrived, and that making that call in that instant and effectively won him the race, and he was able then to hold off Verstappen towards the end, and with many safety cars sort of punctuating those phases of the race, and each time he controlled the restarts beautifully.
And that pressure at the end, Andrea Stella, the McLaren team principal, said there was a little bit of floor damage for Norris. They weren't sure at that time whether it was from the lap 44 trip through the gravel trap you referred to, or a turn 6 wide moment a few laps from home that caused it. But that made life pretty difficult for Norris late on, but he held on.
He did. It was an unnecessary late challenge, wasn't it? I mean, these were very difficult conditions. You can't hold a small mistake against any of the drivers, really. Max made one early in the race, didn't he, when he'd split the McLarens and then obviously lost the place to Piastri. But that Norris one at turn 6, where he just slid wide, got a little bit on the gravel and let Verstappen catch up in DRS range, that was massive pressure he put himself under for the last 2 laps. And given even Norris's most dominant win last year, Singapore, where they had that pace advantage and he just romped clear, he had a couple of near misses, didn't he, in that? And there was a little bit of a question mark at times. Zandvoort, when he had to come back from losing the lead off the line, which wasn't a Norris thing. Both McLaren started poorly that day. There was just this little sort of narrative creeping around the edges, weren't there, that even when he had a car advantage, Norris couldn't just blow them away. I felt like he'd partly put that to rest in Abu Dhabi, when he just won so serenely. But obviously Verstappen wasn't in the picture there, and Verstappen had helpfully taken the other McLaren out of the picture as well. So to come through something, self-inflicted or not, because there were so many different challenges faced today that weren't in Norris's control, and he dealt with all of those brilliantly, I think he just about earned a bye for the mistake a couple of laps from home. And then the fact is, he didn't then choke. He did actually get the job done. And I know it's easy to sort of watch on telly and think all you're doing there, because it's so hard for someone to overtake when you're on when you've got the track as it was in those final few laps. You put the wheel just a couple of inches offline, and that's what Norris did at turn 6, and it very, very, very nearly cost him the win. So it would have been easy to throw it away properly.
Yeah, and I think some credit as well for that decision making when he did have that off through the gravel. Andrea Stella said that the drivers had been told to come into the pits as soon as the rain wet the track.
That's the earlier off through the gravel, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the lap 44 one.
The turn 12 one.
Yeah, exactly. And it would have been very easy to get a bit flustered. You have the off, you're trying to get the car back on. He just kept Verstappen behind him, and it would have been very easy just to almost forget that it would be a very good idea to go into the pits.
But he could have focused on Verstappen, couldn't he?
Exactly,
entirely?
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was good presence of mind to do that, and I think, someone was going to hit the water that came down first, and it happened to be the two McLarens.
Well, especially as last year we had a few of these podcasts, didn't we, where we talked about McLaren and Norris's ability to kind of react in the moment to little moments of chaos. Steady state conditions, as you like to call them, Ed, were where McLaren and Norris were really effective last year, but Canada and Silverstone, they weren't. But I asked you, Mark, just before we were doing something earlier about how decisive that was, because it did look like Verstappen was going to nip ahead, didn't it? And if he didn't, he would have been under massive pressure. So it was a make or break moment.
It was, yeah. And I think not only the Canada and Silverstone races last year that you mentioned, there's also Sochi 21.
Yeah.
They were all hanging over him like ghosts at various stages of this race, weren't they?
Yeah.
When you thought, right, what's the right thing to do? What's the right tyre to be on? When do we change it? What are they going to do? You know, am I going to lose this race through, circumstance? It would have been very easy for that to have, caught up with them. But it was, if they were ghosts, he exercised them.
But Scott, let's talk about the team order. That was issued to Piastri when he was looking quicker than Norris, and it sort of froze the battle for a few laps. Didn't delight the home crowd. Was it justified?
It didn't delight me. I don't think it delighted any of us, but especially when you see two cars streaking clear like they were at that phase of the race, and it was the qualifying edge that emerged on steroids. That kind of, there's a bit of an edge over the course of the lap, and then sector 3 suddenly they're putting a second on everybody else as the intermediates fade. You know that Verstappen's not in the picture anymore. You need something to happen to take this race away from McLaren, or hang on a second, Piastri's closing on Norris really quickly. Maybe these two can just go at each other. And there was half the race for them to really go at it. Piastri gunning for a home win. It was perfectly set up. And McLaren, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but last year, they spent all of last season showing us that they don't like making clear, decisive team orders. They tied themselves in knots at times last year, not doing that. So it was very un-McLaren to come over the radio at that point with a really firm, clear directive not to race. Hold position was the order to Piastri. I didn't like it. The fans didn't like it, but from a pragmatic point of view, as soon as it happened, I thought they're just gonna. They know that they just need to get through this phase. They're so close to a crossover. There might be some rain coming where they need to save the tyres.
Back markers were in play.
Yeah, now's just not the time. And I really, and it's very convenient to say this, but I really think they'd have made that call with basically through gritted teeth. I don't think McLaren wants to impose an order like that.
It was also a team call, by which I mean it wasn't we want Norris to win and not Piastri. I have no doubt that if the positions were reversed, they'd have done the same thing. They just thought that was a perilous little mini phase of the race and they wanted to lock it down. But I don't think Piastri was very pleased, was he, Mark?
No, he wasn't, obviously not, because from a team point of view, yes, you're just securing the 1-2, and there's a little bit of high jeopardy there around that time where you're going from the Indus phase to the dry phase, and you want to get that right, and you're lapping back markers, and you want that not to, to blow up into an incident between your two drivers as one tries to take advantage of the other. So you just want to take the jeopardy out to lock the 1-2 in position, and then you can worry about which order that 1-2 is once you've got that period of jeopardy out of the way. But from Piastri's point of view, that was the perfect time. That was when he really, really needed to be able to attack, because you were coming up to that first pit stop, and whoever's ahead gets pit stop priority. And so he needed to be ahead. He needed to put the overtake on. And in just the moment, he's taken 3 seconds out of him in 10 laps. And he's, possibly going to be in a position to do the overtake, especially with the help of some lapping back markers. He gets told, no, hold position. And just it was almost the perfect wrong time for him. So, yeah, I can very well imagine that he was displeased by that.
And when you factor in that okay, you always have to be aware that the time a radio message gets played over the broadcast is always a little bit out of touch. It could have happened 30 seconds before, it could have been a couple of minutes. There was something almost borderline sarcastic in the message that Piastri then got, that it was okay to race, by which point he'd had that wide moment, hadn't he? And he'd fallen 2.5, 3 seconds behind. I was like, no, it's fine now. Yeah, crack on.
Yes. Yeah, he was no longer in a position to pass. And his response to the team orders was very him, wasn't it? It was, if you just read the words, they're very pointed and very plain what he means, but the delivery is just completely flat. You wouldn't know anyone was, giving an aggressive message. It was just sort of, and are we still holding position now? We've cleared the traffic, and said, "Can you tell us your pace?" He said, "You can see my pace."
Yeah, the order to it's okay for you to race now once the opportunity to race was no longer there could have come out of the Ferrari Charles Leclerc playbook today, because Leclerc had some fantastic radio messages, especially the one where he was complaining about his seat getting wet and got told it's probably the water, and Leclerc replied, "Just said we should put that in the words of wisdom."
Yeah, it's the latest edition of the Book of Wisdom, I think. Is it?
Absolutely, but I think overall quite a bit of sympathy for Piastri, because there was this tantalising prospect, because he had that slightly subdued end to last season. We've been anticipating this Norris versus Piastri fight. Can Piastri raise his game? And if there hadn't been that team order, maybe Piastri passes him, maybe he wins his home Grand Prix, and we're all saying, "Oh, right,
yeah,
McLaren are dominant," but Piastri's laid down the gauntlet, which would have been fantastic for him. Great for the season, I think, and brilliant for the fans here in Melbourne as well, but wasn't to be for Piastri. But Andrea Stella said that he'd briefly spoken to Piastri at the point that we saw him, and he said, all I stressed to him was there's going to be plenty of chances for good things to happen for you this season. So, on to China, and maybe you can change things there. But it's going to, hurt him. I think there'll be a little bit of unhappiness on the Piastri side. Reading between the lines, just sort of reading the hints. There was nothing explicit, but I'm not sure Oscar Piastri and Mark Webber and those around him would have been entirely delighted with how that was handled. So let's keep an eye on that. But Mark, we've got to talk about Max Verstappen, because he just did what he does, didn't he? He made the best of it. He wasn't far off winning the race. Does the performance prove he can at least be a factor in the championship fight, in that he will always be hanging around?
Yeah, I mean, he's got a second place out of a car that was, a good way off. It was 3/10 off. And yes, circumstances helped him there, but he absolutely maximised and fully exploited those circumstances. And as you say, could have won the race. And that was thanks to the interruption of safety cars and the reset of new tyres and things like that. If it had just gone all the way through, no, he would have been a long way behind. But the fact that he can do that with a car that's not quite on the pace just tells you that if the Red Bull's anywhere near the pace, he's going to be winning races.
Every time that Red Bull is so vastly far apart in the qualifying order or the race between the two teammates, I just find myself just wishing you could put them in neutral machinery to just see just how much of it is Verstappen. Because much like we said so often when Sergio Perez was there, that car was not the Q1 exit car or marginal Q2 car that Liam Lawson was making it look. And I know that Lawson didn't have the running that he needed in FP3, so there were some mitigating circumstances, but by Liam's own admission, he was slow on Friday. Didn't feel bad in the car, just didn't have any pace, and really laboured at times during the Grand Prix as well, while Max is out front just having absolutely no business splitting the McLaren for the first stint, or the first part of the first stint anyway. And then even once that's gone, he's it's not just he's just edging it for best of the rest. It was never going to be anyone other than Verstappen, was it? Like chasing the McLarens home. And I honestly thought in those last few laps, I thought he might get it. Like there's just something so imposing about Verstappen in that mood, and it was just that pressure he was able to put on Norris in the end. Even though that car had clearly been so much quicker all afternoon in all conditions, there was something so menacing about the way that Verstappen was behind, and it suddenly didn't look like a sure thing for Norris. And I just think I could maybe have put any driver car combination behind and still had the confidence, Norris has got the pace to do this, but just Verstappen, it's just a different story. And I think he will need to get opportunistic this year based on how quick the McLaren looks, and also the fact Red Bull needs some time to optimise things and improve that car if it's going to win on merit. But if he can come this close to winning a race he had no business winning, he will be a championship challenger this year, even if he doesn't have a car advantage.
Yeah, he's just going to keep being there, maximising the car, isn't he? That's absolutely what he does. And yeah, a looming presence he will be. We'll probably talk about this more in the midweek podcast, but just in summary, this proved the McLaren is the car to beat, didn't it, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. It had probably a bigger advantage here than it showed in testing in Bahrain. And Lando was talking about that, actually. He was saying that this is, a circuit where he feels it was shown to its a good light, and he expects China to be similar, and he's not optimistic about Bahrain. So it's quite interesting that even though that they consider that one of their weaker circuits, it looked the quickest car there, albeit not by as much as it looked the quickest here.
Yeah, there's a bit of concern about the car being a bit wind sensitive potentially. Yeah. Although I think some of it might just be that McLaren never, ever, ever wins in Bahrain, does it? Despite the Bahraini ownership, yeah. They've never won that race. Yeah. Even the year when they went to the extra long version of the circuit that they thought would suit McLaren better, that didn't help. So, maybe that's part of it. But yeah, McLaren confirming title favourite status. But still, I think a little bit early to assume they're going to be steamrollering the season. But very, very good position they're in. Quick reminder for anybody interested who's not in the Race Members Club, we've still got that 90% off your first month offer available. That's closing though, so this is your last opportunity to sign up. 90% off your first month. Loads of extra stuff you get there. You get ad-free listening, you get advanced view of some articles and videos, you get bonus podcasts, you get to ask questions on our race review podcasts. So check out the link in the episode description or go to Patreon and search for The Race for more information on that. Well, let's get on to Mercedes now, because George Russell drove a very tidy race to third place. So tidy, there's actually not much to say about it. Perhaps more interesting in the world of Mercedes is Kimi Antonelli taking fourth on debut, having started down in 16th place. Now, some of you might be surprised to hear me say fourth, as he was originally fifth, having been hit with that 5-second penalty for an unsafe release. However, Mercedes successfully petitioned for a review based on the new evidence of footage unavailable to the stewards at the time. That was the roll hoop camera and helicopter footage. And it was decided that Antonelli didn't cross into the fast lane in the pit lane until a significant distance down the pit lane after checking he was clear of Nico Hülkenberg's Sauber, and the roll hoop camera showed there was room to safely pass the McLaren pits and not endanger mechanics. So that meant the penalty was reversed. Well done to Mercedes for using the right of review properly, which isn't something that happens often in F1. So Scott, all of that said, how impressive was Antonelli's drive?
Yeah, really impressed. I think what we saw from Antonelli this weekend was just a great showcase of the peaks and troughs we'll expect from his whole rookie season, with some fantastic high points and the odd misstep. He's an incredibly entertaining driver to follow, even if it's in a practice session. He has absolutely no fear or restraint, and sometimes that came to his cost. It was ultimately a self-inflicted issue for qualifying with the running wide at turn 6, for example. He had to spin, didn't he, early in the Grand Prix, which meant he had to pass Nico Hülkenberg twice. I thought I was watching a replay into turn 11. So hang on, he's already done this, but it's because he dropped himself back behind the Sauber. But yeah, he kept the intermediates alive. Well, he didn't apart from that spin, he didn't do anything stupid that meant when the opportunities were there in the race, he couldn't capitalise. And obviously Mercedes timed it excellently for him, but he still had to get the job done. I thought it was, it wasn't flawless by any means, but this was a very difficult weekend to be flawless and a very difficult race to be flawless in. And you saw what happened to rookies and experienced drivers alike in the Grand Prix. So I think this was... it's hard to say. I was going to say we saw the best and worst of Kimi this weekend. What worst would be harsh, because obviously it's a very, very relative term where someone of his ability is concerned.
Yeah, I think it was an impressive debut, and obviously he's very inexperienced. I think we have to put a little bit of a caveat in, because he did do that bit of damage in qualifying. He did go out in Q1, and he was 10th when he hit the right pit stop on lap 44. Anyone who pitted on lap 44 was basically in the money. That was good for all of them. I'm not trying to do down, because he's 18, very inexperienced, a phenomenal talent. So really, really great to get this result. But I think this is the kind of tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going to be impressive about Antonelli. And I think, as Scott alluded to, what was particularly good is he did just largely keep it on the island, didn't he, Mark? So it's a nice start for Antonelli, and I think probably quite important for him just to bag a good result early on, just to kind of put in the background all those memories of Monza and the crash in FP1 there.
Yeah, and you did see once he got past some of the slower traffic and he had a bit of clear air, and it was still, the track was still pretty damp. You could see he was running at sometimes even quicker than Russell. So, the pace is there. It's just going to be a question of hooking it together, yeah.
Absolutely, and obviously the conditions. Carlos Sainz was caught out, crashed under the safety car. Jack Doohan, fellow rookie, crashed on the first lap proper of the race. Fernando Alonso,
another rookie.
Absolutely, yeah. He crashed. Isaac Hadjar on the formation lap, a horrible moment for him. It happens. You know how that can happen in those conditions. So there were loads of ways to trip up, and actually just merely having a relatively clean race with that exception of one spin, which actually just replicated something Russell did in FP1. Actually,
it was like a carbon copy, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah, dropping a wheel onto the grass. So, very, very positive for Antonelli, and I think just having those points on the board, finishing behind George Russell, that's a very important result. But I think there's greater performances to come from him this year, and I think he's going to really kick on from that. Now, Alex Albon, he finished fifth, had a really good weekend. We'll come back to his drive and Williams' performance in a bit. And also, Lance Stroll drove a very tidy race to sixth place for Aston Martin, didn't put a foot wrong. Also benefited from stopping for intermediates on lap 44, along with Norris and Antonelli and George Russell as well. That was the right time to stop. But that allows us now to get onto Ferrari, Mark. Now, practice suggested they were going to be in contention. Charles Leclerc, in particular, was very quick. Yeah, he ended up qualifying seventh and finishing eighth. And, fairly disappointing weekend for Ferrari. So what exactly went wrong?
It was, and there was a couple of things. It was not hanging on to its rear tyre performance very well. And you saw it bleed all its lap time away in Sector 3 in qualifying. And it wasn't great on the tyres in the race either. Partly, it was down to how they were running it. It seems that as the qualifying session had got hotter and everybody was adjusting tyre pressures and front wing flaps accordingly, they didn't. They just stayed the same. And the car just got worse. And you saw it 10th off in Q1, 4/10ths off in Q2, 6.5 off in Q3, and it was all at the end of the lap, all the deficit, and so that's what left them starting where they did. They ran. Leclerc was running behind Russell, at a similar sort of pace. Hamilton was a few places back because he'd been beaten off the line by Tsunoda, so was sort of stuck between with Albon and Tsunoda in the slow cars between him and Leclerc. But there was a brief moment where they were running first and second. Leclerc, the Ferrari had tried to throw the dice on that lap when the rain had hit. And they decided to stay out on slicks. And even when it was obvious it wasn't going to work, they tried it for just another lap and then just another lap in the hope that it would come right. And it just got worse and worse. And so, they had to bail out of it, which had lost them a lot of places. So, Lewis briefly led the race, but only because everybody else had pitted and Charles had spun. And so, they ended up, 8th and 10th, I think, which is very, very disappointing for the car's potential. It's not. That was they didn't exploit that car very well this weekend. And on Lewis Hamilton's side of the garage, you can say, well, that's fair enough. It's the first time that engineer and that driver's worked together, and he doesn't yet fully understand all the systems on the car and all the tools. But on the other side, I don't see what they were thinking, really. I don't see the words just weren't very dynamic in a weekend where you really needed to be dynamic. It reminded me a bit of old Ferrari rather than the more accomplished Ferrari we've been used to in the last year.
Yeah, it wasn't very Vasseur era Ferrari, was it? So I think we can potentially put it down to a bit of an aberration, just one of those weekends that things didn't quite come together. And obviously, Leclerc was 8th, Lewis Hamilton was 10th. There was that brief moment though where when Bortoleto and Lawson were off, where if there'd been a red flag,
yes,
as you pointed out, Scott, there was just that brief alternative reality where there's a red flag, you have a short restart, and Lewis Hamilton wins on his Ferrari debut if he hangs on for a few laps at that. But that was very much not to be. It would have been a very, very different podcast if that had been going on.
Yeah, I think Fred Vasseur was asked after the race about the kind of confusion, the situation, the lack of performance, and he said it's his job to be concerned about everything, but he's just adamant that what they saw today, and I guess across qualifying slightly as well, isn't actually reflective of the performance that they can see this season. I got the impression reading between the lines that they're kind of clinging to the pace from FP2 as a bit more of a real show of what the car was capable of. I did ask Fred what was kind of going on in that period of chaos of do we pit now or not, and kind of how much time did you think or how much time did you actually have to make the decision? And he basically quite quickly said, we clearly got it wrong. Like, we should have stopped. The Norris call to dive straight into the pits was actually risky, because if it had just been like, one brief isolated shower or something else, like actually there's some like fluid or something down at the corner, you think it's rain but it's not, it could have backfired. So that's why I think so many drivers didn't pit straight away, but as Fred said, they should have pit the lap that Verstappen did. It would have mitigated the worst of it. The only thing I didn't really understand is kind of there wasn't an explanation from Ferrari as to why it fell away from Friday to Saturday. I mean, the simplest explanation obviously is that if they've not adjusted for the way that the temperatures have changed and the tracks have changed, the track conditions changed because of how hot it was on Saturday. Nice and simple. But I also feel if it was that simple, Fred might have been a bit more forthcoming with that as the justification for it when I spoke to him this evening.
The thing is,
he may not have wanted to drop his engineers in front of the bus, but I suspect it was as simple as that. But,
it's funny though, because one thing about the Ferrari is it's been pretty good often, but it is always sort of doing things, and it's a bit fluctuating in Bahrain. So it could just be they're not quite in the window, haven't got the tyres right, and there is performance in there, but there's just that little hint of, is this a slightly capricious car? Still very, very early to say that, but I'll be interested to see how they get on in China. They've got obviously a few days for a turnaround, and they can go there, and they'll be hoping for a vastly improved performance. Scott, it's worth quickly talking about just Hamilton's performance overall, because you followed him very, very closely throughout the weekend. So what did you learn?
He is adjusting still to the way the Ferrari needs to be driven, or certainly the way that Charles Leclerc likes to drive it. But there were clear signs, I think, through the weekend that he was starting to make that adaptation a bit more effectively. I think after, a really confidence-inducing run through the testing a previous car program that they did with the 23 car, the even the Pirelli test in the 24 adaptation, then the pre-season test and so on. I think Hamilton learned more on Friday here than he has in his first 2 months at Ferrari. He admitted that he thought he was further along the learning curve, and then actually went out in FP1 and was like, I don't know what to do. Like, he was coming in from sessions and didn't know what setting to suggest, and he's been really open about it, and I'm sure there are some people who think he's done it to make excuses, but you listen to Carlos Sainz in Bahrain testing, and Carlos was like almost angry, wasn't he, when he was talking about like the lack of testing that's available, and how if you're switching teams and searching for all of those fine margins, you're never going to do it in a day and a half. So it's not just Hamilton. So from Friday through to the end of qualifying, there was a clear shift in the way Hamilton was driving through the vast majority of the corners. He, in a lot of especially the medium speed stuff, so like for like turns one and two, the S's for example, he was doing a much better job of braking a little, like rolling off the throttle just a little bit, then braking a little bit earlier, rolling higher minimum speed through the corner. That wasn't the way he was trying to do it the old Hamilton way of attacking the corner entry initially. He never quite got on Leclerc's terms in the higher speed stuff. It just looked like there was a bit of discomfort and lack of confidence in the car that meant he needed a bigger lift, a bit of a dab of the brake just to settle himself. But there were also signs where the combination of getting a bit closer to Leclerc's style in some corners and sticking to his own approach through others was actually netting Hamilton a little bit of a gain over like chunks of the lap. He was really, really good at getting back on the throttle quickly. Turns 4, and then which obviously is the left-hander, the one that Antonelli and Russell spun at. He would lift early. Lift a bit more than Leclerc into there and get a better exit. Same 9 and 10, quite consistently, he was trading off a little bit of entry speed at 9 and then a better run through 10 and all the way down to 11. So there were definitely signs that Hamilton was making an adjustment in the Ferrari that he never seemed to either be able to make or want to make with the last couple of Mercedes cars that he drove. He can't quite do the magic Leclerc brake throttle overlap, but he might not need to. I think there were enough signs that he can be quick in this car. I think the bigger question mark at the moment is just how quick that car is going to be overall.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think this is a kind of a qualified success for Hamilton, isn't it, Mark? On paper, it looks pretty poor and disappointing, but I think he's shown that the ingredients are there for him to be bothering Leclerc over the season, which is what he needs to be doing.
I think if you're being realistic about the scale of the challenge of going from one car to a completely different one and being measured against maybe the fastest guy there is out there, I think it's unrealistic to think a day and a half's testing and you're going to show up at the first race and you're going to be on that pace. I don't think that was ever a realistic proposition. And so I think he started the weekend around 4/10 off. He qualified around 2/10 off. He was on much the same race pace, just out of position. I think it was fine. I think it was a reasonable foundation.
What we haven't talked about yet is actually the leading Ferrari engine car, which was, astonishingly, Nico Hülkenberg's Sauber. He finished 7th. Now, Scott, I've been slating Sauber based on testing, so
they've noticed.
Exactly.
You didn't get a name check, but I'm fairly sure we weren't alone in rating Sauber.
Sauber was last. Sauber was last. It was the slowest car in Bahrain testing.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely no. Sauber internally rated Sauber last.
Yeah, I think there was just a little bit of because I spoke to their technical director James Key after the race, and he was more of a sort of sweeping. It was more of a sweeping reference to the fact that they were coming out at the bottom of all these rankings, and all these the car looked terrible, and all the other cars looked better. And he said something along the lines of, we knew there was more to come, and so not listen to that. So just park what happened in Bahrain and focus on here. Now, it's easy to say that with hindsight based on the result, but it's also easy to say that with hindsight now knowing that they brought a new front wing and side pods and basically their actual 2025 car.
Yes.
Like it wasn't a B spec or anything like that. It wasn't like they did a 24 car in the test, but it's significant that they were might make myself look silly here, the only team to bring a major upgrade to the first race.
Yeah, I mean, it was like you say, it wasn't a B car. It was the fact that
it was the proper car,
the proper car that turned up in Bahrain with the initial launch car basically, and this was what everybody else had in Bahrain. This was their equivalent.
Yeah, exactly. So
and there was a huge difference. I went out on Friday and watched trackside in FP1 and FP2. I was up at turn 6 in FP1, and the Saubers came through initially. I was like, oh, well, that looks very different. And I just thought, well, maybe it's just they're not really pressing on yet, and we'll start to see the benefit. And then it just became clear, like within seeing a few quick laps, and I'm like, oh, right, okay, Sauber have taken a step now. Whatever was going on in Bahrain is now no longer happening. So it was visible in that the car was visibly poor in Bahrain, no question about that. And it was visibly much better here, to the point where it was a Q2 worthy car.
It was immediately more respectable in the midfield from the first session, and Hülkenberg was in the top 10, wasn't he, in FP2? Yep. So basically, there's another thing as well, really interesting. I need to really dig into what it was Key said specifically about this, but he quite strongly alluded to them getting something just inherently wrong with the what's the word? Not the mechanical setup, but basically the construction of the car for the test in Bahrain, which they then realised on review was wrong, and then they knew that they could put that right and get a balance gain for here. I wondered if the way that they configured the car effectively for testing gave them basically a massively reduced window for where they could run the suspension, because everything that we saw and everything that you heard, I remember by the end of testing, it suggested that car was just way too stiff, and that they Key said earlier this weekend, like, they were softer by the end of the test, but softer by the end of the test, if they were absolutely rock hard on day one, doesn't mean that the car was running as soft as it needed to. So I wondered if they got the mechanical platform in a better place here. Then they put the real aero on the car, so they were just also producing more downforce, better aero characteristics. And that's the difference. So yeah, they were much more respectable. They were in the fight, and then they took advantage. It's as simple as that. That is how that midfield is. There are a few temps between, a Williams, for example, and Sauber, or whichever teams are at the back of the midfield. I'm not counting Haas in the midfield, because we judged that damn wrong, and they were absolutely on their own in a C class this weekend. But this was Sauber sort of closer to where they ended last year. Key said he doesn't think they're quite as potent as they were in the last couple of races of last year, but they didn't look like they were going to start this season even as they ended 2024. So they're actually in a much stronger position. The only caveat is whether this track and everything this weekend brought the best out of the car, and they might regress a little in China. We won't know for another few days.
Yeah, Nick Hülkenberg seemed to suggest the track helps a little bit compared to Bahrain, and Hughes, all his experience, drove a good race. I mean, he was 12th when the pit stops happened, and he leapt up, so that was good opportunism there. And I think it's positive because, frankly, Sauber underachieving has become quite dull. We want that team to be doing well. We want Audi to be a credible team and work their way towards the front, and we need it in this pre-Audi era when it's Audi owned, but it's not yet kind of badged up that way. We need that team to be making progress. That's very, very positive. So, yeah, I'm pleased to see that. It would have been horrendous if Bahrain was what was lying in wait for Sauber. So yeah, credit to them for making that step, but still a long way to go there. But very good for them to nail that race, because Sauber operationally haven't always been particularly good of late as well. So it's great that it just all came together. And Gabriel Bortoleto had a good weekend as well before he crashed out. A little bit of uncertainty whether there was a problem that caused it, that there was a failure that you could see happening after he'd spun that suggested that caused the spin, but there was a bit of lack of clarity about.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an idiot answering this, and I also don't want to put the wrong words in Key's mouth, but I'm sure he said something like that. There's no initial evidence that the failure caused the spin, which he was sort of suggesting that Gabby getting wide on the curb is what actually caused the snap. But then I think he suggested that it's possible that the load that went through the rear suspension as it rolled backwards off the curb, because he's something about like how the load goes through the suspension when it's obviously running in, when the wheels and everything's running in reverse versus the way that the car's meant to be going. He thinks that might have triggered something. So yes, something failed before he hit the wall. He did hit the wall, didn't he?
Yeah, he did hit the wall. Yeah. You can see the
eventually, but yeah, before then you can see the right rear.
Yeah, but
is all askew.
Yeah, but they weren't. They really weren't sure. And by the time Key was pretty open about a lot of things when we spoke to him this evening. I think he would have just said that something weird happened and there was a failure. I don't think he would have covered.
No, they might just not necessarily know. Bortoleto did radio in to have to check the car, because he clearly felt something a little bit before that. So I do wonder if something had started to go or some such. There's obviously something they need to work out. Teams don't necessarily know. They don't know everything. They need to go through data and have a look around and study the failed parts, etc. So there may be a deeper explanation of that one to come. Mark, there are also some drivers in this race who are a bit unfortunate. Pierre Gasly ran in the points for much of it. He didn't pick at the right time. They had a bit of a wide moment in that first S. That cost him, and he ended up down in 11th. How about Yuki Tsunoda, though? Yeah. Led the midfield in qualifying, ran in the top 6 for much of the race, only to stay out too long on slicks. before switching back to Inters and out of the points.
Yeah, he had a flawless weekend, really. It was just that Ferrari-like decision to try and stay on the slicks when the second batch of rain came. But he was quick. I mean, the car's quite decent, clearly, but he was quick all weekend. He was consistent. He converted that in the race. He did everything right. And it was a top performance.
Yeah, and I think he's upbeat at least about the pace of the car. Racing Bulls keep making progress with that car, and it looks like a very, very handy midfield machine there. And Tsunoda, very, very strong weekend. And I guess when you have a situation where some people win by pitting on the right laps, you get somebody pitting on the wrong lap. And two other drivers pitted at the same time as Tsunoda, and it's the two Ferrari. So that tells you how wrong that particular call was. For the first time this year, we're going to answer members club questions about a race. Loads and loads of questions in. Far too many to get through, unfortunately, but thanks to everyone that sent one in. I'm sure we'll get to more of them in our midweek podcast that we'll record in China. Quick reminder, there is that 90% off offer that's about to end, but you've still just got time to get in if you want your first month's membership. But let's get on to the questions now, Scott. The first question comes from Michael Sooley. It felt as though every Lewis Hamilton radio was being played, and honestly it felt quite jarring. The broadcaster was trying to play to the narrative despite the conversations feeling relatively normal. Is this an indication of how the Hamilton-Ferrari relationship will be portrayed in the media, or will this hyperfixation end?
I think there was a lot of attention on it because it was the debut, and also because of the nature of the race. There were kind of immediately, not points of tension necessarily, but areas in which crucial decision making comes under the pressure and scrutiny. And it was the first chance to hear how Hamilton and his race engineer would communicate, just in general, but also in situations like that. So yeah, you had moments of like disagreement, but it's disagreement in probably the loosest possible terms. Does fall pretty much within the normal realm of disagreement between a driver and their race engineer. But I think it actually, I didn't mind it. I didn't find it egregious because I actually found it quite informative hearing a reasonable amount like that, because there was also you couldn't take it out of context. There was not really a huge amount of snappiness, and I thought it was actually quite healthy the way that the Riccardo Adami was actually responding to Hamilton in some areas. Like, you could hear, I felt it lent itself to the narrative that Hamilton is on a learning curve here and Ferrari's on a learning curve with him. Even little things like when he was saying, Adami's trying to sort of encourage him to, try different settings. It's difficult, but try because it's good practice. And Hamilton saying, I'll do it when I'm close and stuff like that. Like, there was no like underlying tension or issue or friction there. I think it was just a bit of a window into a live learning exercise, basically. And eventually this hyperfixation will end. Yes, like it should do anyway. We're as guilty as anybody of doing a huge amount of coverage on Hamilton and Ferrari because it's a massive, massive story. It's the most successful driver in F1 history, again, joining forces with F1's most famous and storied team. So that's just how it is, and it was always going to kind of reach critical mass on his debut. It might increase or decrease at different times over the next few months when he's doing well, when he's struggling, whatever. I'm sure around Silverstone and around Monza it'll also be pretty big, but it felt just about it felt on the right side of it, even though it was obviously a lot more commonplace in the broadcast.
Mark, a question from Hatman. He says, what's the feeling in the Ferrari camp after this race? Do they just get the setup strategy wrong, or is there something inherently wrong with the car? We've touched on this, but what sense do you get the feeling in the team? Is it a bit baffled?
It probably is. It's not something that Freddie Vasseur would be open about at this stage. But I think, there's got to be a concern there because the car inherently looked in Bahrain and looked in the early part of this weekend very competitive. A good solid car, maybe not quite as quick as the McLaren, but capable of racing it. And it turned out to be nowhere near that in qualifying and race. So they definitely missed something. And we've touched on what we think it is, and the picture will become clearer the more pieces to the jigsaw we get.
The next question I will take comes from Jack Aitken, the Australian Jack Aitken, not the ex-Williams F1 driver. It says, I really enjoyed the written analysis while sweating and shivering in the stands this weekend. Great work as always. Will Australia's home driver podium curse ever end? It's a good question. An Australian driver's never been on the podium in the Australian Grand Prix in the World Championship era that started in 1985. So what's that? There have been 39 races, and in that time there have been quite a lot of successful Australian drivers. So it is bizarre, isn't it, that it just hasn't come together. I certainly thought the podium was going to happen. I thought the win might happen, but it's such a shame because there's such a desire, I think, for a home win here. Obviously, Australians love their home heroes. That's always it. And I think, as I always say, a home Grand Prix win is always a good one in any country, isn't it? That's a good storyline. I'm sure it'll happen at some time. I mean, it'd be a surprise if Oscar Piastri doesn't win the Australian Grand Prix one day. He's got that new McLaren deal, so he's going to be at the front of Grand Prix racing for a good while yet. But it's going to be a big day when it finally happens, I would say. And incidentally, actually, from mentioning watching from the stands, just want to give a quick shout out. I was watching quite a few marshals listen to our podcast, which is great. They've been doing a great job out there. I just wanted to throw in a little vignette about how good a job the marshals do that I saw. Because on FP1, as I said, I was up at turn 6 and gravel kept being pulled onto the track there. And there was a point where I overheard a little conversation on the marshal's post, and one of the marshals had spotted like a little bit of metal debris had been thrown off. Just as soon as it happened, I think it may have been off an Alpine. And I heard this little discussion. And then shortly after, they had the red flag because they needed to not just clean up the gravel, but a bit of metallic debris down. And it was not easy to see. And I just thought that was just a little vignette of the kind of job the marshals do. I mean, I know people always do the thing, the sport couldn't happen without them. But actually, it's not just the fact they're there. They're also very, very good. And Australian marshals are great. So thanks to any marshals who are listening as well, because I've learned that quite a few of them listen to us.
I got a biscuit off one of them as well.
Ah, very good. Yeah.
Turn 9. Thank you.
Turn 9 biscuit. Do you get anything out of a marshal, Scott?
No, but I appreciate their service and thank them for their loyal listening. That sounds very nice of them.
Excellent. So yeah, I did want to make sure I found an excuse to mention that. But Scott, another question related to Lewis Hamilton. Oscar Piastri made a great last lap move on Hamilton. Can you imagine a 20 or 30-year-old Hamilton being passed there like that? Is it a sign Hamilton has declined as a driver?
He was doing his best to defend against a car that was a second and a half faster. I mean, Piastri dunked. It was about 3 seconds on like that Hamilton group, wasn't it, in the last couple of laps? So no, there was no chance of holding it back. I mean, I'm sure people made excuses given the circumstances, but nobody decries George Russell's ability as a racing driver for being passed on the outside by an old Lewis Hamilton in Abu Dhabi last year on the final lap. It's just also as soon as you're on the put it this way, the way those two cars approached that corner with the speed offset and the amount of grip one car seemed to have versus the other, there was only ever going to be one outcome.
The next question, Mark, from Oscar Robledo, said we'd come to this topic. Was Alex Albon's finishing position testament to the Williams pace, the weather conditions, or a combination of both? Not discounting Alex Albon's abilities, of course.
Yeah, it was a little bit flattered by what we touched on before, people pitting at the wrong time, but not very much. He was running behind Yuki Tsunoda, so he took advantage of that. He was running behind Charles Leclerc, so he took advantage of that. But the Williams was nip and tuck with the Racing Bull, the class of the midfield. It was an easy Q3 car. Both drivers getting into Q3. It was very fast on the medium tyre in the dry. So yeah, it's a good package. It's two quick drivers, teams operating well. I think that was a well-deserved position.
Scott, do you want to try out our prototype sympathy corner for the year?
Carlos Sainz sympathy corner.
Yeah, I don't think we'd need it very much, but we probably do need it this weekend.
Based on everything else we've seen so far, it'd be a surprise. I mean, put it this way, if we need to visit it, he's really earned it in a car that looks that competitive. It obviously started so well with Williams this weekend. Sainz looked absolutely rapid. There was one point on Saturday where I was absolutely convinced we were going to see Carlos going like third row of the grid on a set of mediums in Q3 because he was so fast I think they were on the hards when they were doing their quali sims in FP3. But They obviously got on top of the worst of the soft tyre woes that they had in Friday practice. But it didn't quite come together for Sainz when it counted in qualifying. He just missed a little compared to Albon, and he was left lamenting, that little bit of unfamiliarity with the best of everything you need to get the best out of the Williams. And then, of course, his race lasted less than a lap, and after Hadjar shunted on the formation lap and Doohan shunted 5 corners in, Sainz then managed to top both of them, being an experienced driver, by shunting after the safety car boards had come out. They weren't behind the safety car at the time, but it was safety car conditions. And it's a weird one, and it seems best put down to Sainz's unfamiliarity with the torque delivery when the Williams is in safety car mode, basically. Yeah. So it was a bit of a weird one.
It was a very sudden upshift, apparently, with a big, torque load. It's just one of those things that you need to be aware of, yes.
Yeah, so a well-earned sympathy corner, but I think we may have to remove Sainz from sympathy corner ownership because I think he's going to have a good season.
I think the fact that you haven't bothered to corner him to force a Sainz sympathy corner jingle suggests that you don't think we're going to need to go here very often this season.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen too often. Really strong start for Williams, and very much needed, I think, for that team, and just shows how strong the car is. Next up is a question from Robin B that I'll take. Any guesses how it would have played out if everyone made the right call on strategy? A Max win, points for Tsunoda, podium for Ferrari, and also Ansi Rulamo asked what was the ideal strategy for the late race rain? Was there any gamble that could have launched someone from the middle of the pack to the lead? This is a case where these are two really good questions with an extremely boring answer because the correct strategy was the Norris strategy. It was stop on lap 44. If you stopped on lap 44, great. If you didn't stop on lap 44, do what Verstappen and a few others did and stop on lap 46. And if you really want to ruin your day, stop on lap 47 with the Ferraris and Tsunoda. So actually, the race we'd have had is, let's say, Norris and Piastri. They go off, so Piastri's race is ruined, so he's down the order. You're basically going to have the order pretty much as it was. So it would have been, I still think, Norris winning from Verstappen, Russell, Tsunoda would have been up there, Leclerc, Albon. So it would kind of been in the race that we would have had. There was no pitting on lap 43 wouldn't have helped.
No, it wasn't ready.
Exactly.
You weren't ready for the wets.
So there was no gamble available to anyone. The gamble that was good was the lap 44 one, and that's why Hülkenberg and Stroll benefited, and that's why Norris and Albon and Russell consolidated. Antonelli benefited as well. So, good question. Sorry the answer wasn't a little bit more dramatic. Scott, a question from Nathan Bailey. Are Haas cooked? And we've got a couple of other questions that elaborate a bit on that. Michael Brown asks, why did they bail out of staying out late on? If you're going to do that, why chicken out? And a similar question from Christian Rose about whether a chance of points was wasted by not sticking with the gamble to stay out. I suspect the answer on those strategy questions is you could do anything you wanted in a Haas and you were not going to be finishing in the points.
Yeah, so the only way to finish points in a Haas today was to change your car and not actually complete the race in a Haas. That car was never going to get anywhere near. And the reason they bailed out is because it wasn't going to work. It was you kind of cut your losses because it's only going one way. That team was absolutely stunned by its lack of pace this weekend. I think it's totally blindsided by the issues that it's had. It had no high-speed performance at all this weekend. Clearly some kind of aerodynamic issue. What is unclear at the moment, because they don't even know, is whether or not there is just something that is absolutely not working on that car, which means it is simply not producing the aerodynamic performance, or if something about the way they've set the car up, put the cars together, whatever, this weekend has just ended in the absolute worst case scenario for it, because there was no sign of this at testing. And I'm not saying that to bail us out for saying that Haas looked really solid in the midfield and didn't look like it was in trouble at all, because, well, from our perspective, there was no sign of this at all, but they were completely surprised by this. I've spoken to people in Haas, and Ai Komatsu has said as well that there was no warning of this in testing, and the lack of aerodynamic performance that car seemed to have here, they were so far down, even other midfield cars through like the 9 and 10 sweeps, for example. And the only way they managed to get like remotely closer in cornering performance then came a clear loss of straight line speed, which suggested to me that they piled wing on through the weekend, which tallies with something I was told about them sort of addressing some of the weaknesses on Friday, but then causing problems elsewhere around the lap. It's baffling. It really is. But that would have shown up. Something there should have shown up in Bahrain, and either it was there and it was staring him in the face and they didn't realise it, either it was hidden by something else, either it could have been avoided or spotted sooner if they'd just done some low fuel work or some performance work instead of the rigorous high fuel work that they were doing. But we said at testing, and Haas genuinely thought this, team, drivers, everybody at Haas thought this, if you took the fuel out the car, it would suddenly go a lot faster. And everyone was waiting. You went trackside on Friday, Ed. You went trackside on Saturday, Mark. I spoke to Jolyon Palmer from F1 TV's coverage. He was waiting for it as well. And every time the Haas came through, it just never went quick. And it never got there. It got to a slightly less unrespectable deficit, but it was still cut adrift.
And it's worth noting as well, Ollie Behrman had an absolutely horrible weekend. Crashed in FP1, missed FP2. Managed to put it into the gravel in FP3 on his first flying lap with a moment of imprecision into turn 11. Had a gearbox go when he went out in qualifying, probably as a result of the various incidents that had happened, and then was condemned just to driving around in a not very quick car. He was quick enough in the race for driving a Haas, but horrible weekend for him.
He was the only rookie after all of that through the nightmare weekend not to have some kind of drama during the Grand Prix. Which meant he saved a little bit of face for himself and for me for describing him as the best prepared rookie and the rookie most likely to be able to start the season on the front foot.
Question for you, Mark, from Jack Lando Norris seemed much more aggressive, shutting off both Oscar Piastri and Max Verstappen at the start. Is this a showing of learning over the winter?
Yeah, I think to an extent it is, and he's talked a little bit about it already, but I think we'd already started seeing it towards the end of last year, in Mexico in particular. I think... he's learned to put the pieces together, and whether he will always prevail, it isn't really the point. It's just he takes a confidence into the race with him, I think, now that perhaps he lacked at this stage last year when he was less seasoned at running at the front.
Next question I'll take from Vir Nikari. What's the procedure when the DRS is activated and deactivated during the race? Who decides? And what are the parameters for it? In Melbourne, it looked awfully slippery when race control allowed DRS. Well, broadly speaking, it's allowed when it's dry and not when it's wet, but there is a muddy middle there. They will allow the DRS to be used when they feel it's kind of dry enough, even though it's still damp. They did go quite early with it in this race, actually. A few drivers actually even were not willing to use the DRS at times. Nico Hülkenberg was one. He said, actually, it was really sketchy. So for a few laps, I wasn't using it because I didn't really want to have a crash. There's a few DRS zones that are not straight here. So, that's what it comes down to. Obviously, there's other things. If safety car, yellow flags, all those sorts of things, it's disabled. But basically, it's when it's safe to do so, and there's no kind of absolute when is it dry enough, and so there's a bit of discretion there from race control. So it's basically the race director. Scott, a question from Tyler Hall. What do you think about Liam Lawson? Obviously, he's never driven here before, but the amount of mistakes and times he went off was a bit excessive. You should note that question came in after qualifying, but still applied in the race, didn't it? Yeah,
crashing out of the race and doing what Hajar did, but at least not doing it on the formation lap, was an inglorious end to an inglorious first weekend for Red Bull. Lawson was slow on Friday, not uncomfortable in the car, just slow. And then Saturday lost running on in FP3, which might have been a similar issue, if not the same issue, as what cost him time in the car on day 2 of testing. That put him on the back foot all round, just going into qualifying, but he didn't execute. Again, he ran out of tyre basically at the end of the lap and understeered off. An understeer moment that was, as I was watching it I was watching the onboard from the from down in the mix zone during qualifying, and as soon as I saw him hit the brakes and start to turn in, just one of those where you're like, he's never making the corner. and so out in Q1. I mean, he pointed out that he was half a second up, but he was so far off that being half a second up just meant that he was only sort of maybe going to potentially sneak into Q2. And then, I actually don't know if there's any kind of specific problem that held him back in the race, or if it was just stuck, because it was just a totally forgettable debut.
Mark, a question from Dan Neal. Is that the Kimi Antonelli that everyone's been hyping up? Fantastic drive. Only rookie to keep all four wheels going round on the tarmac. Well, Behrman did as well, and Antonelli did have his brief moment. But yes, certainly a very fine drive. Who was the most recent rookie who provided such an incredible drive on debut? It's probably Behrman, isn't it?
Yeah,
Different
I guess so. Yeah, different circumstances. But yeah, he stood in at almost no notice for signs at Ferrari, and was unlucky not to get it straight into Q3, and who knows what it could have done from there. But yeah, he drove. I would say, Behrman was probably the most recent.
Yeah, and it's rare for a driver to come in sort of such a high-profile team as well. So it's not the same, but Lewis Hamilton finished third on debut, didn't he, for McLaren Mercedes, then the Mercedes Works team back in 2007 here. Obviously passed Alonso at the start, which was a bit more startling. But, very much a marker from Antonelli on his debut. And, as I said earlier, this is the driver everyone's been hyping up, but I think it's only a glimpse of what he has the potential to go on and achieve. But I think this is a nice foundation. Final question from Lachlan Babbage. We've all heard talk of Doohan's seat being under threat, but should any of the other rookies, I'm including Lawson here, have any alarm bells ringing after this weekend? I don't think so massively. I will mention Doohan because we haven't really in this podcast. He had that shunt, which obviously was not what he wanted on the first lap of the race. Terrible error. But equally, he was properly quick this weekend. He was as quick as Gasly, at times a bit quicker. And I think that's very encouraging from Doohan. Like I said, Doohan's got a fight on his hands, but he's got a bit about him. And he has shown he's absolutely going with that, right, I'm just going to use the fact I've got this car to impress. And I think that although you cannot say this was a great start to that, I think the pace was very, very encouraging. Hadjar, I think overall similar sort of story, disastrous formation lap crash, but actually decent turn of pace, not at Tsunoda's pace, but qualified 11th. Looked pretty good, so I don't think Hadjar's gained any extra pressure. Lawson, I think, is probably the one who, as Scott's alluded to, will be a little bit concerned. And he's in a Red Bull, isn't he? And Red Bull love replacing drivers, don't they? I don't think they'll be replacing him in China or anything, but I think Lawson will just be hoping this was just a bit of an aberration and he can go to China and restart. Bortoletto, I think, had a good weekend. Good impression from him. Behrman in amongst the rookies. Horrible in practice, decent race in a terrible car, but he's still well regarded. Antonelli got those points on the board, so I don't think any of them need to be too worried based on what happened in Australia. But probably the one who's overall got the biggest concern is indeed Lawson. But I think we'll see him get more out of that car very, very soon. Well, we've covered a lot of ground on this podcast. Certainly a very dramatic start to the season. Scott, do you want to do something you promised you do in the Members Club?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to the people that engaged in a little Helmut Marko, Ollie Oakes caption competition. But I was walking back through the paddock on Friday after going through the pit lane, looking at the cars during the tech display, and in a very quick fire bit of Alpine antics at hospitality, I could see Flavio Briatore looking through his phone, flanked by Gasly, Doohan, Ryo Hirakawa and Franco Colapinto, which ridiculously is only 4 of the 6 drivers that Alpine technically has under F1 contract. I was wondering if they were playing reserve driver Tinder, where Briatore was just swiping left or right on different drivers that they could sign. But then I also clocked that Helmut Marko and Ollie Oakes were deep in conversation, and this was about 24 hours after it emerged that Marko had called Doohan a C, giving him a C rating as a driver, and said that he wasn't going to survive the thing. So I just put the photo on our Patreon and just asked for best captions for it. I won't read them all out here because it's the kind of thing that doesn't translate very well into a podcast at all. But if you want to get involved in in this kind of thing, maybe we can have a little bit more fun on the Members Club on Patreon. So thank you to Andres Bastanturi, Robert Pepper, Alexander Law, Duncan Bertram, TJ Preston and 928 Pilot for getting in on the act. I think there's going to be a few opportunities this year, probably especially around Alpine antics, to have a little bit of fun. So maybe we can make the Members Club on Patreon a nice little safe space for that.
And if that's not going to persuade anyone who's thinking about it to take that 90% off your first month Race Members Club membership, then I don't know what else will. Well, the season started now, but we're heading straight on to China for the next race, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.